A crowd gathered, phones out, capturing as two white cops twisted the arms of a black man in a business suit, oblivious to the fact that he was the mayor's grandson. His calm only fueled their aggression, and the degrading questions kept coming, sharper and harsher. But when the truth came out, the ensuing scandal rocked the city and became a catalyst for change. What he did next would shock even the most jaded. But let's start from the beginning. Jason, a 27-year-old black man, was making his way home after a long day at work. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit and polished shoes, he moved with a sense of purpose, his mind still occupied by the day's responsibilities. His wrist sported a sleek high-end watch, a recent gift from his family for his hard work and accomplishments. Little did he know, this quiet evening walk through the city park would soon become a turning point in his life. As he passed a small park near downtown, two white police officers, Clayton and Evans, noticed him. The officers were in their early 30s, wearing the standard police uniforms with badges shining under the streetlights. They exchanged glances and decided to approach Jason under the guise of a routine check. Clayton led the way, calling out to Jason in a tone that implied authority. "Excuse me, sir," Clayton began, his eyes scanning Jason's suit, his watch, and his briefcase. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Jason paused, visibly surprised, but still calm. He'd dealt with situations like this before, and had learned to stay composed. He greeted the officers politely and complied, hoping to diffuse any suspicion. But as the officers began their questioning, it became clear this wasn't going to be just a routine interaction. "Nice watch," Evans remarked, his eyes narrowing. "Where'd you get that?" Jason felt a pang of irritation at the intrusive question, but remained composed. "It was a gift from my family," he replied calmly. The officers exchanged a skeptical glance, clearly not satisfied. They moved in closer, their questions becoming sharper, prying into his job, his income, and his connections. Clayton's tone grew more challenging with each answer, as if Jason's calm responses were somehow a personal affront. Jason's restraint seemed to annoy them further. Evans, crossing his arms with a smirk, remarked, "You must be doing pretty well for yourself. Mind telling us exactly how you can afford all this?" Jason took a steady breath, his patience wearing thin but his demeanor unchanged. He met Evans' gaze directly, responding simply, "I work hard for what I have." Seeing Jason's refusal to show any sign of guilt or fear, the officers seemed to interpret his calmness as defiance. Without further explanation, Clayton suddenly grabbed Jason's arm, pulling his hands behind his back as Evans slapped on handcuffs. The metal bit into Jason's wrists as the officers informed him he was being detained for suspicious activity. Jason's shock was evident, but he maintained his composure, choosing not to mention his family connection just yet. He wanted to believe they would realize their mistake without needing his grandfather's name. Clayton and Evans, however, seemed completely unaware of the significance of their actions, oblivious to the fact that they had just detained the mayor's grandson. As Jason stood cuffed, tension simmered in the air. A crowd had started to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of a well-dressed black man being arrested in such a seemingly aggressive manner. Smartphones emerged from pockets, and people began recording the scene, murmuring in disbelief. Some bystanders voiced their protests, calling out for the officers to let him go, but Clayton and Evans ignored them, focused solely on their suspect. Inside, Jason felt a growing sense of frustration and anger. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a random stop. He was well aware of the reality he faced as a black man, even one with professional success, in a world where appearances often dictated assumptions. But he chose to hold his silence about his family, unwilling to use his connections to gain favor. He hoped the officers might see the injustice on their own. The officers ushered him into the back of the squad car, and as the door closed, Jason could see a few faces in the crowd, their expressions a mix of concern and outrage. Despite the humiliation, he kept his composure, knowing that any reaction could worsen the situation. At the precinct, Clayton and Evans led Jason to a small interrogation room, where they began to search through his belongings. The officers worked with a mix of arrogance and self-assuredness, as though they'd made an impressive catch. Jason watched in silence, his expression unreadable, but a hint of intensity in his eyes communicated that he was fully aware of the significance of this moment. As Evans rifled through Jason's wallet, he suddenly froze. There, nestled between Jason's other ID cards, was a city-issued credential. He pulled it out, his face instantly paling as he read the name and designation, a direct link to the mayor's office. The realization was swift and absolute. He shot a wide-eyed look at Clayton, who stepped closer, his own expression shifting from smug confidence to dawning horror. The silence in the room grew thick and suffocating. Jason's stillness, his unspoken calm, now carried an ominous weight. He held their gaze with quiet intensity, saying nothing, but making it abundantly clear he understood the gravity of the situation better than they ever could. Evans swallowed hard, his hand trembling slightly as he placed the credential back in Jason's wallet. They both understood the consequences of their actions now. This wasn't just any man they had detained. Their arrogance and bias had led them to target someone with significant influence, and the full reality of their mistake hit them like a shockwave. The certainty that their actions would not go unnoticed settled heavily between them, and for the first time, a palpable tension filled the room as they waited for the next move. Within hours, the video of Jason's arrest began spreading like wildfire. The footage, shot by multiple bystanders, captured every detail. Jason's calm compliance, the officer's aggressive tone, the moment the handcuffs clicked shut, and the growing crowd's murmurs of disbelief. Social media quickly picked up the story, with hashtags calling for justice. Influential bloggers, activists, and journalists shared the video, decrying the clear abuse of power and lack of justification for Jason's detention. Comments and reposts multiplied as thousands rallied behind him, using the incident to spotlight systemic injustice within law enforcement. The following morning, major news outlets began covering the story. Headlines condemned the officers' actions, questioning the basis for their arrest. Reporters dug deeper, discovering Jason's family connection to the mayor. This revelation added fuel to the fire, transforming the story from a simple arrest to a major public scandal. The mayor, learning of the incident involving his grandson, took immediate action. He issued a public statement expressing outrage and sadness over the ordeal Jason had endured. His voice, usually steady, quivered with anger as he promised a thorough investigation into the officer's conduct. "This is not only a family matter, but a matter of justice and accountability for all citizens," he stated, emphasizing his commitment to reform within the police force. He announced a press conference, inviting Jason to speak firsthand. That afternoon, the press conference room was packed. Reporters, activists, and community leaders filled the seats, anticipation buzzing in the air. Cameras flashed as Jason stepped up to the podium, looking both composed and resolute. Clayton and Evans stood at the back, forced to witness the very public reckoning their actions had unleashed. Their faces were pale, their postures tense as they faced the reality of their own actions, exposed before the world. Jason took a deep breath, glancing briefly at the crowd before beginning his story. He spoke with quiet strength, his words carrying a weight that left the room silent. He recounted the humiliation, the assumptions made about him, and the unspoken reality that his race had influenced the officer's decisions that night. "What happened to me," he said, his voice steady, "was not an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger problem, one that affects black men and women across this country every day." His words resonated deeply. He spoke not only of his own experience, but of countless others who faced similar treatment, shedding light on the broader issues of racial bias and systemic injustice. Some in the audience wiped away tears. Others clenched their fists in anger, feeling his story as if it were their own. Meanwhile, Clayton and Evans were rooted to the spot, forced to absorb every word. The weight of Jason's experience and the public's fury pressed down on them, a bitter reminder of the consequences of their unchecked biases. They exchanged nervous glances, realizing that their mistake had sparked not just a scandal, but a movement for change. For the first time, they began to grasp the full scope of the pain their actions had caused, not only to Jason but to the community watching and listening, demanding accountability. As Jason neared the end of his speech, he paused, letting his final words resonate in the quiet room. Taking a steady breath, he looked out at the audience, his gaze unwavering. With calm conviction, he declared his intention to fight for systemic change within law enforcement. "This experience," he said, his voice strong and clear, "has only deepened my resolve. I won't stop until we see real change, not just for me, but for everyone who has faced injustice simply because of the color of their skin." His statement was met with a swell of applause, mixed with cheers and nods of agreement. It was a powerful moment, one that resonated far beyond the walls of the room. Reporters captured every expression, every word, knowing this was a turning point, not just for Jason, but for the movement at large. Under intense public pressure, the two officers, Clayton and Evans, were compelled to come forward and apologize. With cameras rolling and dozens of eyes fixed on them, they mumbled apologies, visibly uncomfortable. Their earlier arrogance was replaced by a mixture of shame and regret as they acknowledged their mistakes. Though their apologies seemed strained, the symbolic impact was clear. The officers had been humbled and held accountable in front of the very community they had wronged. The mayor, moved by Jason's courage and the overwhelming public support, took to the podium to make a commitment of his own. With an air of solemn determination, he promised to implement reforms aimed at addressing racial bias within the police force. He outlined plans for mandatory training on racial sensitivity and implicit bias, regular community engagement sessions, and the establishment of a civilian oversight committee to hold officers accountable for their actions. His words were received with hopeful applause, and his promise felt like a first step toward long-awaited change. As the press conference ended, Jason felt a profound sense of relief and validation wash over him. He knew his journey wasn't over, that true change would take time and relentless effort. Yet in that moment, he had achieved a moral victory. His voice had been heard, his experience acknowledged, and his story had sparked meaningful action. Walking out of the press conference, Jason was greeted by a crowd of supporters, people from all walks of life who had been moved by his story. They thanked him, some with tears in their eyes, expressing how his courage had given them hope and renewed strength. Through his ordeal, Jason had not only exposed a grave injustice, but had become a beacon of resilience and possibility for countless others. The ripple effects of his actions would extend far beyond this moment, inspiring a collective demand for fairness and dignity. In his victory, Jason found a deeper purpose. He would continue to fight, not just for himself, but for the countless others who deserve justice and the chance to walk freely, without fear or prejudice.